Okay.
Yeah.
I will begin time now. There are an estimated 9 million Syrian refugees fleeing their country. And when we look at what these people are, who these people are, they are people without food, they are people without shelter, they are people in need. Now, when we look at the resolution like we have today, the United States federal government should repeal the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act of 1966. My partner and I will define that as the United States federal government should repeal the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act of 1966. And we will also provide the weighing mechanism of fairness. Now, when we look at these refugees, the people that are in need the most, we do see a parallel, much like Cuban refugees, fleeing the communist regime in the 1960s. And this is when this act was established, to help those type of people. However, now we see a large divide. And we see the new people that are in need are those in Syria. Now, in my first affirmation speech, I will be going over three main things. One, how the current system isn't fair. Secondly, our plan. And three, the benefits of said plan. Yes?
Okay, so just before all that, can I ask, how exactly are you evaluating what is and what isn't considered fair? Like, what perspective goes into that? What's that criterion?
We look at what should be just according to general consensus. It is just to treat two people fairly if there's no reason to not treat them fairly. If one person is in more need than another person, then we should give to the person that is in more need than the person that is in less need. If two people are equal and are thus not in unequal need, then we should treat them equally. That's what we're judging this debate on. Now, first of all, how the current system isn't fair. Currently, Cubans, it takes approximately 1 year for them to become full-fledged official citizens. Whereas if we look at Mexicans and Venezuelans and other countries, it takes up to 20 years, 4.5 on average, to be fully integrated. Now, we can look at another policy of this, the dry foot policy, which currently states that if a Cuban is able to get onto some beach or some land, predominantly we're talking about Florida here, and they get onto the sand, they can achieve a path to legal immigration, which is absolutely ridiculous. Just because they were able to somehow manage to get there doesn't mean that if one, a Mexican is able to do the same thing, that they should be treated any differently, but two, it shouldn't be a law in itself. It shouldn't be a part of it, and it is part of this legislation that the affirmation is trying to refute today. Now, we can also look to how the act helped the refugees. It did initially help. It did make it easier for people to come in. They were people that were trying to flee this communist regime. They were trying to flee Castro. However, I'd like to bring up a quote from Victor Arita, one of the people that did benefit from this plan. He says, quote, "I did benefit from it. However, I wasn't fleeing communism, and I've never even been to Cuba." We see that one of the parts of this bill is those in Mexico, Venezuela, and one other country can achieve immigration through this policy, even if they weren't born in Cuba. If their parents lived in Cuba for some amount of time, they can still do it. We see innate flaws in this plan, and that's why we have to repeal. We see that it's archaic, that it's now abused. Venezuelans, Mexicans, Brazilians, even some people in Russia and other countries are claiming Cuban residency because of the USSR and what happened back then, and they achieved legal immigration to the United States through this bill. It didn't achieve what it was intended to do. It helped other people. Yes, it did help a lot of Cubans. Yes, it was beneficial initially, but now we see all of its fallacies. And it's time to repeal it, which leads us to our plan. Our plan is that Congress will repeal the act as soon as possible, and from now on treat Cuban immigrants like those from other countries, such as Mexico. Now, this would not nullify any current immigrants that have immigrated to this country and are in the legal process. However, further restricts this act from continuing to have an effect for those that are not yet a part of the process. Now, when we look at the benefits of this plan, we see that Cubans aren't in desperate need anymore, and that this would balance that fairness that we're talking about. If Cubans were more in need than those in Mexico or in other countries, then we would say, yes, they should receive more attention. We should help them. But when push comes to shove, Cuba nowadays is equivalent or very much increased than when it was when we first enacted this bill. For example, according to WordPress, Cuban education is 5th in the world, whereas the United States is only 20th. again, according to WordPress, they've increased 30 slots in quality of life since 1970, and 96% of Cubans now own their home. That's significant increases from figures that we saw years ago. However, now it's starting to approach that of Mexico. It's starting to approach that of Venezuela. And so why should we allow these people to receive a higher status, or why should we pay more attention to them when there are people equally suffering? Yes?
Okay, so you're comparing like Cuban, so like right now Cuba, because of the Cuban embargo, has been in a pretty tough spot. The majority of Cuba is in poverty. So why is it fair to treat them in the same immigration status as someone coming from like a developing country like Korea, for instance?
Well, first of all, Korea. I'm trying to relate it to other Central American countries like Mexico, and the Korean immigration policy and other immigration policies are actually much more relevant. I think it's 66% of all immigration comes from Asia. I'm trying to limit the scope of this debate. If you want me to clarify further, to countries in Central America, to countries that are south of the United States, countries that are third world countries, countries that are more in need than those in Cuba. Now, as I only have 52 seconds left, I'd like to get to what we're talking about here. Let's look at this in the broad spectrum. The Affirmation and I is proposing legislation. We're saying that we should get rid of this act. This removes archaic laws. It was established in the 1960s to help flee Castro, to help flee communism. We see that that is not nearly as prevalent as it is today. We see that there are other people that want to come to the United States. Now, I'm not saying that this will get rid of any problems we have in our social immigration system, but I'm saying we're taking steps forward. And if we are going to treat some nations more prevalently than others, we should be looking to Syria. We should be looking at people that don't have homes, as opposed to 96% in Cuba. We're looking for the next step in immigration policies. We're looking for progression, fairness. And that's why you have to vote in the Affirmation today. Thank you.
Judges ready? Essen? Yep. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start time right now. Just before I begin, I would like to just thank everyone here for making this debate possible. Congratulations to my opponent and to my partner for making it this far. Well, let's just go over what they've talked about in their last speech, and then after I go over their argumentations and refute them, I'm going to be moving on to our own. So let's just first look at their definitions and how they've really defined this debate. And the first problem we have is with their weighing mechanism of fairness. And we brought this up in a question, but what we have to understand is that measuring fairness is kind of not real. Like it's hard to measure fairness in terms of what we're measuring fairness of. Now, they talked about comparing it to immigration policy like Mexico, but we can clearly see that the situation in Mexico and their situation in terms of like their economic status, the social status of the people in there is far different from the one in Mexico. So treating them the same and trying to create fairness in terms of keeping everyone exactly the same doesn't really make sense because they're not in the same situation. And so because it's so confusing and because we don't know exactly what metric they're using for fairness in terms of what they're comparing to be fair and to not be fair, we should be looking towards this at a net benefit scale which favors everyone. What that means is we're just going to be looking at the benefits of the plan and seeing whether or not it actually has a net benefit or a net harm, comparing the two worlds that the affirmative gives out. We think this is a more fair framework, and we think that this offers for a more educational debate because we can actually weigh whether or not something's beneficial or not, and the weighing mechanism shouldn't just be whether something's fair or not. But regardless, I can just go through their argumentation and see how this really works out in the room. So the first argument that we have to see is that they say that it's not fair, and they talk about how it's 4.5 years and all that. But what we have to understand is that the situation in terms of like countries that have a 4.5 year and countries that might have like a 20-year term for trying to get into the United States to get citizenship is completely different, and so we can't be comparing these on a term framework. Secondly, we have to understand that like they don't really offer a way to compare fairness, and so because of this, we can offer a different alternative to fairness, which is why don't we just give Syrian refugees and people like that the same access that Cubans have instead of repealing this act. They don't necessarily give you a reason inherently why this is bad, and we're going to be looking at that later in the case. Now, their second advantage is basically they talked about loopholes in Venezuela, Brazil, and Mexico, and what we have to understand is that this isn't a reason to repeal. This is a reason to reform. Getting rid of this act and getting rid of all the benefits that it has to the Cuban people, allowing them to gain economic freedom in the United States is beneficial. They never talk about that. What they do talk about is they talk about this loophole, but loopholes can be fixed. This is a single clause in an act that can be reformed, and because of that, we can't be looking at this as a reason to ignore all the benefits that the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act provides. And so because of this is a reason to reform, not repeal, so don't be looking towards the act plan. Now, their advantage to their third advantage is that basically they're no longer in need. And so this isn't, the Cuban situation is different now. And again, we have to look at the fact that we're looking at fairness here in situations between different countries, but comparing Cuba back then to Cuba now, they're still super underdeveloped. They're still living in the 60s because of the United States embargo. They're still driving Model Ts around. And so what we have to understand is that they're still behind the rest of the world, regardless of what country you're looking at. So their situation is still not fair. And so because of that, this act is still important to helping them out. So let's move on to the off case and what my partner and I have been talking about today. So the first disadvantage to the plan is that this hurts relationships with the Cuban people. Right now in the status quo, according to a Gallup poll, they see that Cubans actually favor America and closer relationships with America very well. And so the reason for this is because of the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act, because right now they can come to the United States pretty easily, and so that they can make sure that they can have economic freedom and better lives. So they view America as well. But right now what happens is that this goes away once this plan is enacted, because all of a sudden we're stopping their revenue into we're stopping their way into getting to the United States. Yeah, what's up?
Can you describe the United States benefits from having better relations with the Cuban people?
Yeah, so we can just talk about the Cuban, the economy, which is our second point. So let's just move on to the second disadvantage of the plan, which is remittances. And what remittances are, it's when someone goes to a different country, makes money there, gets an education, gets a job, and then sends money back to their family. And what we saw with the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act is the Cubans were actually moving to America, getting their fast track to citizenship, getting a job, and then sending money back to the people in Cuba to improve the Cuban economy as well as the United States economy. And in fact, we saw that the Cuban Research Institute says that about 1/3 of Cubans receive money from abroad, which means that they're getting money from Cubans being in America. And we saw, in addition to that, we can see that the State Department has actually said that in 2014, an estimated $1.4 to $2 billion have come from remittances from America, which means American and Cubans living in America have sent about $1.4 billion to $2 billion just in 2014 to their families back in Cuba. And so what we can clearly see is by allowing this fast track to citizenship, it helps these Cubans get better standing, it helps them get jobs, it helps them get a better education in America, which allows them to send money back to their families in Cuba and support their families and support the Cuban economy. Now, secondly, we have to understand our third disadvantage is innovation. And so the thing with innovation is, like we've said before, the Cuban embargoes have happened since the 1960s. And so what we can see is that since we just opened up relations just this past year, we can clearly see that Cuba is actually very behind in terms of technology, in terms of medicine, in terms of the development that have happened in the last 50 years. And so what we can clearly see is by allowing the Cuban refugees a fast track to citizenship, we allow them a fast track to development. We allow them to more quickly develop, more quickly innovate, and more quickly get in touch with the rest of the world. And so because of that, we're helping the Cuban government, we're helping the Cuban people by helping them get into America easier so that they can learn more, they can learn faster, and that they can send the technology back to their people, back to Cuba, who can start innovating and who can start catching up in the economy. So we can clearly see a need for this in the status quo, and that the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act is actually a good thing, which is something they don't really address. And so because of this, we offer the following counterplan, which you should be comparing to the plan. Now the counterplan is, instead of repealing the act, we keep the act and instead offer the same adjustment act we call the Syrian Refugee Adjustment Act of 2016. And so what this does is it offers the same type of act to the Syrian refugees that are going on right now. And so what this does is it does a couple things. First, it guarantees the fairness that they're talking about. Right? We're helping the Syrians as well get a fast track to citizenship and reach some of the same benefits that the Cubans have been doing. And secondly, what we have to understand is that we're making sure that we don't have the same problems that they do in their plan, because we see that the Cuban government and the Cuban people are getting massive benefits from this. They offer nowhere in their case a reason as to why the act is actually bad. They tell you nothing about the Cubans being hurt from this. They tell you nothing about America's economy or anything being hurt because of this act. And so what you have to understand is that the Cuban Refugee Adjustment Act is doing good things for the Cuban people. It's doing good things for the American economy as well. And because of that, we should keep this act and we should follow the same model when dealing with other countries, when we look at political refugees from countries like Syria. And so if we follow along with the counterplan, we can clearly see it's a clear, better alternative than the plan, which is why I strongly negate today's resolution.